Jesus, Thomas, it took you long enough.
How do you even go about talking about a game that includes an absolute god-tier set piece like this? Yes, this is a dude escaping from crazy homeless people by the means of riding in an actual garbage bin. And this is not even the craziest thing he does in this game. Jesus, what the f***? But first, let's take a little step back in time, all the way to the yesteryear of 2006. Back when I was a young lad replaying the first Fable game for the 11th time, I walked through the aisles of an electronics store in a nearby town just checking out new PC releases, and amongst all of the boxes there it was, Condemned Criminal Origins. To be frank with you, I had no idea what that game was about, what genre it represented, nor whatever kind of a video game it could be. I recognized the Monolith logo from the box cover since I played F.E.A.R at my friend's house, but I wasn't even aware of this particular game's existence. And in that moment of silence, I tried to figure out what it might have been. And unfortunately, I just left it on its shelf, forgetting about it for almost 15 years. When seemingly out of nowhere it just came back to me. I suddenly thought to myself, what if? What if Condemned was a hidden gem of the video game history that managed to pass me by? I haven't really read any reviews on it, and opinions online seem to be quite split to me. So I did what you usually should do in a situation like this, and played it for myself. As to what I felt after finally playing it all the way through, that is quite complicated. Before getting to the proper review part of this video, let's maybe dive into the background of this game's development process for a little bit. Not only to make you feel like I did some actual research on this topic and hopefully keep you watching this video for a few seconds more, but to also shed a light on how this whole project came to be and, on the other hand, what it possibly could have been. So, Condemned Criminal Origins was developed by Monolith Productions with the usage of the Liftech Jupiter X engine, the same one which powered the original F.E.A.R and its subsequent sequels, as well as the notorious Middle-earth Shadow of Mordor in its more recent and almost unrecognizable form. The main difference between F.E.A.R and this game though was the fact that the first one was designed with mainly PCs in mind, and Condemned was supposed to be the studio's first foray into making an Xbox 360 title. This obviously leads to a lot of similarities in the technical makeup of both titles, even when you obviously consider that Condemned was originally confined to the limitations of the hardware it was first released on. But all of these elements that are similar should not be a surprise, since Condemned was developed in the same time window as the first F.E.A.R game, on a fairly similar iteration of the Liftech engine. Yet, while still in production, Condemned was supposed to be called The Dark. Though it was similar in concept to what Criminal Origins eventually became, it was more focused on supernatural or even magical aspects of the game, with the main character using spells to track the villains he was after. The final version of this title is toned down quite a bit when compared to that version, replacing magical abilities with investigation tools brought up by a dedicated keybind, although still blending in the paranormal elements, visually reminiscent of F.E.A.R and what it did with its scary sections all throughout. It's worth to note that some aspects of the Dark project still bleed into how the main character is being portrayed in the release version of the game, almost making him into a superhero more than a regular federal agent, which at points can contradict the strives at realism that the developers were making. It all seems to me that the team was conflicted on what vibe this game was actually aiming for. But now, what actually is Condemned Criminal Origins, you ask? Well, in its essence, it is a mix of a first-person brawler/survival horror game with a sprinkling of very light investigation-based puzzles and a whole shitload of homeless people trying to smash your head in with whatever they can find in their vicinity. And that's exactly what the game expects you to do too, by the means of any sort of a lead pipe, wood plank board, paper scissors, fire axe, sledgehammer, or a piece of concrete laying at your feet. Because of that, the environments themselves had to be designed in a way that would support the idea of this truly raw and brutal close-quarters combat, where the elements of the environment become your weapon of choice. And so, the game takes you through a whole menagerie of different abandoned and dilapidated locations, through subway stations inhabited by the apparently clones of Alma, abandoned school building filled with screaming weirdos covered in barbed wire, creepy department store, or a ruined house in some rural shithole. The variety of locations in this title surpasses that of the first F.E.A.R. And where F.E.A.R. focused its technical wizardry on the amazing dynamic shadows rendering as its physics system, trying to replicate the level of destruction seen only in Asian action films, and obviously its fairly advanced AI of the enemy combatants. Condemned is focused way more on creating an appropriate atmosphere, even if at the cost of putting less attention to refining some of its technical aspects. Although the more detailed texturing work, more varied environmental design, very effective even if mostly baked lighting, more intricately designed character models, and a vast array of little improvements to Liftec engine all managed to work in tandem to create a moody, partially a bit grungy look that, even though steeped in millions upon millions of different shades of grey, certainly has its charm. It obviously has not aged well, but I would not go as far as to call it as unpleasant to look at. Even though that the visuals can be quite atmospheric and effective in this title, there are clear issues with the sound department of it, some of which might be explained by its use of EAX, a technological wonder of its time, rendering 3D audio in real time, but a real nightmare for the modern HPC. There are entire scenes that lack most of their sound all throughout, like the train sequence or the gas leak sequence. Just listen to what happens when this very valve explodes. Obviously, that's not all. There are plenty of occasions where some of the sounds of the game either glitch out or seem to be coming from the wrong side of the current area you're in, or just sound horrible. This usually does not affect the different characters' voice acting bits, but the deadpan delivery combined with sometimes quite a bit of compression overlaid on top makes the voices sound unnatural. It's a similar case with most of the combat sounds. Luckily, there seems to be a fix to this title's audio issues, with a Steam post explaining exactly how to go through with it, and to save your ears and bring back the lost sounds of the current version of the game. But what about the times when the audio does its job right? For the most part, it does it really well. It immerses you into the crooked and vile world of the twisted souls dwelling underneath Metro City. Be it just the crackling and yet droning sounds of the piping, ventilation, or an ominous dark ambient tracks that are playing in the background to complement the symphony of destruction and that might not be memorable with an honorable exception of the main theme of the game, but they blend in perfectly with the environmental audiosphere, obviously only when it works properly. Now that we've discussed the technical aspects of this title, let's get to actually critiquing how Condemned Criminal Origins plays. The core of Condemned's gameplay can be described in these 3 words:
Smash, scum, repeat.
Earlier, I described Condemned as a first-person brawler, mainly since that term is the closest thing to capturing the essence of this title's main mechanic, its close-quarters melee combat. And to be frank, it's probably one of the best parts of this title, even if sometimes it can be really clunky and outdated by today's standards. As I mentioned before, you usually don't wield actual weapons in combat. You rather rip out things from the environment to use to deliver the killer blows to the homeless crazies attacking you from all sides. So, what you do is block their attacks and smash them with whatever piece of rebar or wood you currently hold in your hands, tactically tasing them in between or at the start of the fight to give yourself an upper hand against them. And at times you get an opportunity to use on an already half-beaten enemy that ends the fight in a brutal manner. There are actual firearms in this title as well, but their ammo is extremely limited and can't be replenished. So you start wielding your pistol or shotgun like a club and proceed to break jaws of the enemies you encounter, looking for a new, more appropriate weapon. The combat, in its essence, can be quite simplistic, but its visceral nature and the pure aggressiveness of the enemies you encounter do make you feel like you're in actual danger. And since this game precedes the big shift to regenerating health movement in FPS titles, like in Call of Duty, if you get wounded, you need to seek out health packs in your vicinity to heal yourself up before a hobo gets too many hits in you. As you might have noticed by now, the character movement is beyond the point of being sluggish. A simple walk down a pathway downwards or walking up or down a set of stairs can take long enough to question your own sanity. This not only artificially prolongs the time you take to traverse through a level and makes it extremely frustrating to go back to a previous location to pick up a medkit you suddenly find yourself in a need of, it sometimes just makes it hard to catch up to enemies hiding behind some sort of a pillar or a locker. You'd also think that if this game was co-developed by the same people who made F.E.A.R, the emergent and adaptive AI of that title would make its way into this game. Unfortunately, that couldn't be further from the truth, since all the AI combatants do differently than most games is that they sometimes hide and wait for you to pass them to attack you from the shadows. But because of how telegraphed their attempts at hiding are, it almost never works. But as I mentioned earlier, it's just quite hard to catch up to them, but that's on the character movement system. What is undeniably cool though is the fact that the AI combatants fight with each other a lot of times, and if they represent a different group to each other, they will start fighting each other at what seems like only lightly scripted sequences that do add to the feeling of the overall craziness that overtook these people's minds as well as their environment. But since what you are in this game is a federal investigator, there is obviously an attempt at including some investigation-based puzzles in this game. When you enter the game's menu, you can see a whole list of forensic tools at your disposal. A gas spectrometer, you mainly use to find the collectible dead birds, a UV light helping you find fingerprints and traces of blood, a laser light doing very much the same thing, 3D scanner gathering info on the depth and size of certain objects, and a sampling device letting you gather physical evidence, and a small camera that apparently has an internet connection built right into it. That might be the single most futuristic thing for 2005, to be honest with you. Maybe excluding the absolutely ridiculous UI of Eaton's Nokia 3000 or whatever this phone actually is. Unfortunately, the usage of all of these forensic tools is contextual, so you can't even use any of them outside of specific locations that the evidence is located in. So there is no need for you to worry that you won't be able to find the piece of evidence you need, since the game notifies you whenever you're near it. Most of the puzzles aren't all that fascinating, but they do serve a role of giving you a break from the combat encounters once in a while. The one puzzle that sticks out as quite creative in all of this is a puzzle from one of the later stages in the game, where you have to use your UV light on different rooms of the house to find all the pieces of the puzzle needed to figure out what to do next and what items do you need to do it. There are also other sorts of puzzles that require you to use either a fire axe to break down some half-rotten door, sledgehammers to break padlocks, and for some unknowable reason, a shovel to get rid of keypads blocking you access to the next part of the level. So the game forces you to switch your weapons around for those particular segments to be able to progress, which doesn't really add much depth to the game, but does force you to at least search through the level for the appropriate tool for the job. Something that would probably be a little less frustrating if your character could actually run for more than 5 seconds maximum. So, except for the sparse puzzles here and there and numerous combat encounters you're put into, there isn't all that much more to condense gameplay. The rest of your time is spent sluggishly traversing through the levels from one point of interest to yet another. The thing that saves this game from becoming an absolute snorefest at times is the atmosphere it manages to build, both audiovisually, as mentioned previously in this review, but also by the simple means of very effective world building. All the places you visit drip with a sense of unease leaking out of every nook and cranny of the ruined darkest corners of Metro City you have to explore to find the man you're after. I will personally admit that the many spooky horror scenes included in this title, even though sometimes being quite derivative of what F.E.A.R was doing at about the same time frame, could make my skin crawl at multiple occasions. Obviously there were situations that the game used a cheap jump scare, but mostly it builds its tension through the pure virtue of putting you in locations that scream of some disturbing past happenings at every turn, and the twisted and clearly tormented by something unknowable homeless people pouring out of every corridor screaming their lungs at you just add to the aura of ominous and Lovecraftian danger that the entirety of the game expels, even if it sometimes goes straight into the territory of the bad kind of ridiculous Lovecraftian terror. Let's now touch up on the story bit of this game. You play as Ethan Thomas, an agent of the fictional SCU federal agency in the fictional Metro City, where for some reason birds started dying in unexplainable circumstances all over the town. Your goal at the very beginning of the game is hunting down a serial killer called the Matchmaker. In the very first mission of the game, though, after discovering a body, possibly left by the killer, judging by the modus operandi of the murder scene, you encounter a mysterious villain character, a so-called serial killer X, that seems to have ties to the killer you hunt, yet brims with something far darker underneath the surface. Through the pure ploy of fate, or rather the clumsiness of Agent Thomas, Serial Killer X manages to take away your gun and shoot your commanding officer, and then throws you out the window. For reasons unknown at that point, you survive the fall, only to wake up in Ethan's apartment, where a mysterious man from his past, Malcolm Van Horn, warns him that he became a suspect in the murder of his commanding officer. With the help of Malcolm, he manages to run away and begin his own investigation into Serial Killer X, with the help of his agency friend Agent Rosa, who, for the pure convenience of both the plot and the gameplay itself, works at the Bureau's crime lab, and after a short phone call decides to just put her trust into Ethan and lets him upload all sorts of data he wants her to analyze. And so, with her and Malcolm Van Horn's help, Ethan begins a quest to redeem himself by seeking out the Serial Killer X. Oh, and obviously also by killing hundreds of deranged homeless people, seemingly affected by the same disease that kills the birds all over town. From here on, I will have to warn you, since I will spoil the ending of this game as well as few of the main twists in the plot. If you'd rather skip through that, here's the timecode for the next part of this video. See you there!
Store is flooded, his trail ends here.
So, after clearing out what seems like an entire city block of homeless life forms, after learning the truth about what Serial Killer X is after, it being the serial killers you've been investigating all throughout the title. With that knowledge, you manage to corner the Serial Killer X in a countryside town of Briar, where after impersonating the torturer, one of the serial killers that Serial Killer X was after, you finally manage to confront him head-on. And just as you're about to deal a final blow to the guy you were after all of the game, Malcolm Van Horn splits your head open with a shovel and tries to reason with the killer, revealing he is his nephew called Leland Van Horn, which explains why he got involved in your case in the first place. Leland then smacks Malcolm over the head, rendering him unconscious. After that, Serial Killer X takes the both of you to a barn where he intends to kill you, cutting one of your fingers first, when then, suddenly, Malcolm Van Horn subdues him and you spot a mysterious humanoid creature covered in metal spikes looking at you from above. Malcolm explains that it's the embodiment of hate, and that it's the true cause of the mysterious outbursts of violence all over the town. You run after the humanoid, and then have a final boss fight with him, which ends with you ripping his jaw from his body and throwing him into a pit with a gas tank at the bottom that explodes and kills him. After that, you escape Briar with Malcolm Van Horn at your side, but then realize that Leland is still alive and in the trunk of your car. And here comes the only choice to make in this title: to shoot him or let him be. Which is absolutely meaningless, since if you don't shoot him, he kills himself anyway. After that, we jump a bit in time to a meeting between Ethan, now finally cleared of his charges, and Rosa, who reveals that there is a mysterious cult that might have been behind the game's events. Who they are is only revealed in the sequel to Condemned Criminal Origins, Condemned Bloodshot, but that's probably a matter for a different future video. Now, let's talk about this story. To be completely honest with you, I'm rather mixed on this game's plot. The whole ending sequence itself creates way more questions than answers, and that is in a bad way. It does fit in with the almost Lovecraftian underbelly that the story implies all the way throughout, example being the statistics about the dead birds you get on the loading screens between different stages, presented to you as a sort of a police report, as well as descriptions of all of the unexplainable outbursts of violence throughout Metro City, playing into the meta-narrative of the entire game. But it does feel like the occult parts of the story were mostly a remnant of the Dark Project, more than an integral part of a story of an agent on a run. The rather grounded, slow, and visceral gameplay would probably complement without surprise, a more grounded and realistic story. Think more of a darker version of the CSI, rather whatever we are left with in here. The other issue is the overall short length of the game and obviously its narrative, that never truly allows for any of these subplots to truly develop. And as mentioned in the gameplay section of this review, the sometimes extremely sluggish pace of the gameplay prolongs the playthrough in a superficial way. There are certainly a few set pieces that you will remember after finishing it, just like the previously mentioned garbage bin ride / escape, but mostly it can be quite forgettable. All that really stays with you is the oppressive and dark atmosphere of the areas you explore in its runtime, but exact details of what actually is going on can slip from your mind. Condemned Criminal Origins did not turn out to be a diamond in the rough that I had hopes it could be. Moreover, the numerous technical issues, predictable as well as not all that entrancing of a plot, the sluggish pace of the gameplay contrasting the surprisingly short length of this title, this all contributes to the general vibe
of mediocrity
that puts this game in an unfavorable light. Especially when compared to its half-brother F.E.A.R, praised as one of the legends of the FPS genre. But don't get me wrong, Condemned is not a terrible game. You have to admit that for its time, it attempted something quite original, being a first-person perspective title that employed an attempt at focusing its combat almost exclusively to melee combat. You have to also remember that this title actually predates the greatest known kicking simulator that the world has ever seen, so it was quite original. And when you consider that it was combined with the investigational elements taken straight out of something like CSI, something I feel even today hasn't really found its way back into video games except for a few horrible atrocities worth forgetting, you could imagine that it was pretty easy to sell to someone as a title worth owning on your shiny and new Xbox 360. But what about today, you ask? I'd honestly say go and play F.E.A.R, if you haven't played it yet, obviously. It's much better of a game, maybe except the horror department. Here I'd argue yet again that Condemned and its oppressive audiosphere and gritty visuals have ways of raising your heartbeat that exceed those of its half-brother. Especially when played at 3 AM in a room lit up only by your sorrow, regret, and your cheapo IPS monitor with backlight bleed so severe it makes the dark parts of your screen look like they are covered in...
Why do you come here?
I thank you for watching this video. Real life stuff came in and messed up the entire schedule that I've made for myself. Luckily, the next review might be coming up quite soon. Or not. We shall see. Thank you for watching yet again. Sayonara!
Now for the main protagonists. First, Duke Leto Atreides, planetary governor of Dune. He has just been double-crossed by the Emperor and slain by the evil Baron Harkonnen. His immediate